it's time for us to move on to our next talk that will be delivered by Igor Grossmann. He's a professor at the University of Waterloo, and he's one of the leading researchers on wisdom. And in his talk, he'll tell us about a training program for which people can learn and cultivate the ability for wise reasoning.
Some technical issues as usual with this online technology. Thank you so much for having me, Falk. What a beautiful conference, so inspiring, so much positive energy. As a partially Eastern European, the positive energy is not something that comes natural to me. So I feel a little bit hesitant and have mixed emotions, but maybe that's a good thing as well. Today, I would like to talk about the current work, and let me share the screen with you, that is being conducted in my lab. And I hope we can have a little bit of a discussion. Some of this is based on an ongoing body of research. Some of this is rather new, that just came out this year. So I hope you can all enjoy this. When I talk about wisdom, many things may come to mind for different people. And so I would like to clarify that I particularly focus on metacognitive features of reasoning, those things that many of us these days think are very important, such as recognition of limits of your knowledge in the face of fake news, for instance, or recognition of uncertainty and change in the face of the pandemic, or consideration of different perspectives, even from those people you may not necessarily agree with. Well, we have experienced that quite a bit in polarization in different parts of the world, as well as willingness to integrate them together. Now, this is not just my perspective. In fact, recently, when I brought together a large group of people and we decided to analyze what are the common understanding, what are the common working definitions of wisdom in the literature, this type of metacognitive features appear to be central to a variety of wisdom conceptualizations, in addition to the moral aspirations. And the reason why you need this kind of perspectival metacognitive features is because they help you to implement abstract moral concepts or navigate when you have multiple competing moral concepts in a given situation. So in the real world, you hardly have knowledge for everybody's preferences or all the ideas that other people may have on their mind. You hardly ever can come up with a hierarchy of your moral goals. I should be doing this, and only then I should be doing this. Often those things are kind of competing with each other. And so this type of perspectival features may help, at least that's a sort of a claim, a theoretical claim. It still has to be tested. So this is what I want to focus on today, those features. And they are universally valued. At least that's sort of the claim one can find if one looks at the philosophical literature in East Asia, South Asia, ancient Greece, and so on. And there's certainly a demand for them. We're all screaming that we need to be, well, some of us are, maybe not screaming that we need to be intellectually humble, but you certainly appreciate it. There are initiatives for promoting intellectual humility from various funding organizations. There are self-help books on this topic, but how exactly do we get there? And so one way to start is, you may have seen the little talk by Ethan Cross yesterday, who said that he really liked this idea of Solomon's paradox. So let me tell you a little bit more about that and the actual origin story of this. So Solomon's paradox is this idea that Ethan Cross and I came up with to examine the asymmetries in metacognitive reasoning about yourself versus others, inspired by the Solomon, and who was very wise when it comes to other people's problems, but not so wise when it comes to his own issues. But the actual truth is that we were not inspired by this Solomon. We were inspired by another Solomon. There was a Saul Wachtler who was this chief judge in New York, was making very wrote Hallmark opinion pieces on a variety of important issues, including gender equality and so on and so forth. And then turns out that he was harassing his ex-mistress, and that all came up, and obviously his personal life was ruined. And it was only after I encountered the story about the Sol Veckler that I ended up sort of coining this term with Ethan. So that's just a little side story. But what is it about? And is this really true? We know that there are self-other asymmetries in various aspects of cognition in psychology. Do they apply to metacognition in everyday life? To address this question, very simple study at the beginning. I brought people in a monogamous relationship to come into the lab. They either had to imagine that their partner had sex with their closest friend. They've always been in the relationship without any problems. Everything is fine. And suddenly out of the blue, they say this. Or this is the friend's issue who also goes through the same situation. Their partner admits to them that they had sex with the closest friend. And so what do we find? If you look at recognition of limits of knowledge, consideration of some kind of compromise, different perspectives, a consideration of different ways that conflict of this type of situation may unfold, whenever you think about a friend, you're more likely to say that there are more options, maybe I don't know something about this, and so on. And we since then have replicated this in both us as well as other people in different labs, using both this infidelity scenario as well as more age-appropriate scenarios for other populations, including older adults. The question there is like, what is the mechanism here? And this is an important thing. This was just done in the lab, but we wanted to first see what could be driving the effect. And one idea that Ethan and I have been working on before that we thought of applying here is this notion of distant or Illeist self-reflection. So just to give you a pictorial representation, imagine you have a conflict with your close friend, and her name is, well, I'll name her Phoebe here because Phoebe Ellsworth drew this. In case you don't know who Phoebe Ellsworth is, check out the famous emotion researcher. And Phoebe and I have a conflict, and I think of Phoebe and I get really angry, and my vision narrows, and I focus on how horrible she was, and she provokes us emotions, and the situation escalates and escalates and escalates. In contrast to that, if I take a step back and look at it from the side and imagine myself being an observer, I realize that maybe it's me who is provoking Phoebe, and maybe I should chill a little bit and think a little bit about what I'm about to say next instead of provoking her further. So the pretty similar situation, of course, happens when you it's pretty much what you do when you think about the problem of a friend habitually versus when you think about your own problem. Normally, you immerse yourself, you look at it through a first-person perspective, whereas when you think about a friend, you take the step back and look at it as an observer normally. And we know from the philosophical literature, as well as from some other research, that this seemed to be working in emotional domains. It allows you to see the big picture. And as I mentioned, there is this tendency that you can even find in writings of, in ancient Rome about talking about yourself in the third person, not for the purposes of self-presentation like Donald Trump used to do, but rather for the purpose of zeroing in on the issue, but taking sort of a fly-on-the-wall perspective. And so the idea we had was, can this kind of distant reflection reduce Solomon's paradox and convert this rather egocentric King Solomon into Ecclesiastes, which apparently was a book, I don't think it's really correct, that reflects later Solomon, the philosopher king, or the wise philosopher king. And to test this, we had a set of studies in which we crossed this initial infidelity scenario that I presented to you with another manipulation. Specifically, in lung condition, people reflect on the scenario using me and mine, envisioning from a first-person perspective, or they're asked to use their name and use he, she. So like, what would Igor do in this situation? How would he react to this? So envisioning it from a third-person perspective. And when we did this, again, this has been replicated multiple times, even though the effects are not astronomical. Often you reduce and eliminate this asymmetry between your reflection on personal issues versus other people's issues. So this is all very nice. But this is all in the lab. And as with most social psychological experiments, there is a question: to what extent can this actually apply in the real world? Can you use this kind of in-lab experiments and have carryover effects? And we know from other literature that carryover effects into the real world are really, really hard to institute. Often they don't work, often they're exaggerated, samples are too small, studies are hard to do. You train people in the lab, they go in the real world and that effect disappears. There's a transfer problem. And so here the question was, can this Illeism in reflection promote change in wisdom over time? And my idea was, maybe one way to go about this is to ask people to habitually write in the third person over time when they sample different situations in their everyday life. And by sampling across a range of ecological situations that they actually experience and reflect on all of them in this kind of third person compared to this habitual first person, maybe then you will have a carryover effect into another situation that they experience by themselves. So what we did in the first randomized control trial field experiment that we conducted in Ontario was my team basically recruited a large group of people who took part in a 1.5 month long diary. And in the one condition, they were assigned to keep this diary using the first person language as they would normally do. And in another one, using this third person Illeist language, using he, she. So what exactly was the structure? People come into the lab without any manipulation instructions. Then they do the diary. During the diary, which they do at home every day, Monday through Saturday. On Sunday, they have a free day. And then after 4 weeks, we bring them back into the lab to do the next session. And in each of those pre and post sessions, they reflect on the most recent interpersonal experience they had with somebody else, reflect on it, and then we subsequently analyze their reflections, their narratives for mentioning intellectual humility, consideration of change, integration of diverse viewpoints, as well as one of this kind of more morally aspirational features, namely search for conflict resolution. And a long story short, in this first study, we do find a shift in the training condition where people use third-person Illeist language between the pre and post, but not in the control condition. And what is interesting is that this is not just a training of perspective taking. You would expect that, you write in the third person, maybe subsequently you're more likely to think of other people. That's nice. But in addition to that, take a look at this humility component, intellectual humility component, or take a look at the sort of conflict resolution features. Those are the ones that were also driven by this training. In addition to the training for reasoning, we find some additional emotional affective effects. For instance, people were asked to report on positive and negative emotions when they were reflecting on those conflicts in the lab. And we can calculate the richness and relative balance of emotions. And there is some research that suggests that focusing on your emotions in a richer and relatively balanced fashion, so reporting more and less sort of like extreme, I just was super angry, but nothing else, is adaptive for a variety of reasons. It can allow you to get a bigger picture of the situation. And indeed, in some prior work, we've linked this to wise reasoning, to those intellectual features that I characterized before. So when we looked at this emodiversity, which is this combination of richness and evenness of your emotions, we once again saw a shift in a third person group, specifically for negative emotions, which are arguably at place when you reflect on disagreements and social conflicts, and not for positive emotions. That's not all. We also, we tortured these participants. They were really nice to us and we continue to torture them. It's hard to say that in this very positive environment, but what we did after the diary was over, we actually asked the same participants to imagine a set of 6 common positive and negative interpersonal situations with a person they may be close to. So there's like, okay, and now reflect, how would you feel if the certain thing will happen? How would you feel towards this person, including a set of positive and negative emotions? This is forecasting, right? And a month later, after the final come into the lab was over, we asked them, okay, hey, do you remember us? We asked you to fill out those, we want to know if any of these following situations happened. And for many participants, at least one of them happened because they were fairly mundane, such as the other person speaking badly about you, or failed to invite you to a common activity, or you had a disagreement with them and got into a heated argument. Those are some positive things about, you know, they were supporting you, being a good listener and stuff like that, or have a nice dinner with somebody, a celebration. So a lot of those situations did occur, and we asked them for the actual feelings. And what do we find? Well, first of all, we find that there is not really the affective forecasting effect that you would expect. If anything, people were, well, somewhat more extreme in their experiences relative to their forecasts. But what you also see is that the forecasts and experiences were more aligned in this training condition compared to the control first-person condition. Moreover, the change in this wise reasoning in wisdom from before to after the intervention, driven by the manipulation, driven by the intervention, led to greater alignment between emotions, particularly negative emotions. We since have also replicated this result in another randomized control trial. Now, this time it was just like a week long, and it was done on mTurk, and it was mostly done because reviewers wanted us to replicate a whole intervention. Thank you for those people who are reviewers on this. Really appreciate spending another $30,000 on this, really do. Anyways, this study did replicate, and the key thing here that is noteworthy is that we had no instruction control condition, which we didn't have before. Based on prior research, we assume that most people write their diary in the first person. And yes, most people do write their diary in the first person. As you can see, the effects are such that we have greater improvement here in the third person Illeist condition than in other two. So to summarize, what I showed to you today is that the Illeist reflection seems to be promoting wise reasoning, emodiversity, and alignment of forecasted and experienced emotions towards close others over time, and particularly intellectual humility, openness to diverse perspectives, as well as search for compromise. I would like to highlight this unique feature that may be important for this symposium. There is some utility in situating training, whatever you're trying to train, in the context of daily experiences that can have a potential of have a better carry-over effect to other situations people may have in their lives. And so this repeated focus on first-hand experiences from a particular angle that you're trying to train can foster development of wisdom-related habits. There is also an interesting parallel of this work to another year-long longitudinal study, and this is a shout out to Anna Dorfman, who I think has been even in this audience right now. I don't know if I can see everybody, where we for a year tracked people and the experience of adversity. And for those who were reporting adversity habitually in a third-person perspective, more likely to report sort of taking a step back, maintained their wisdom over time, whereas those who were reporting immersing themselves in those adverse experiences reported a substantial decline in the face of adversity, especially for social conflicts. So if you want to know more about the present training study, please check out this Psych Science paper, as well as the freely available manuscript on Psych Archive. And at this point, I would like to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing this really beautiful work with us. I think it's a really impressive study, and I really like the methodology. So far, we have one question in a document, and if other people want to ask questions live, please raise your hand. The question we have so far says, could there be some downside to overdeveloping such perspective? I think about people with split personality who might also be writing their diary in third person for other reasons.
Yeah, this is a fascinating question. Probably. Goals matter. For instance, in a supplementary study of this science paper, I've done an extra study where we ask people, this is just like in the lab, to reflect on this situation, and either with the goal of self-defense and self-promotion. Imagine you're a real estate magnate and your company is accused of moral misdoings. There's some buildings that collapsed, and you have a press conference that you have to prepare. The company is, of course, in your name. You can imagine whom I modeled this after. And then you are you're prepared. You are supposed to have like a journalist coming next. And your goal is either to use your name to defend yourself, or present your company in the best possible light, or to take a distance, a step back, or just to reflect. And there we found that people who use their name to defend their company, of course, don't benefit in terms of this metacognitive features at all. But those who just habitually reflect actually do, because their function was very similar to if you just, your goal was to take a step back and distance. We haven't tested it on clinical populations. I think Ethan Cross has done some work with some clinical populations, but I'm not sure about schizophrenics. So that's a fascinating question. I also think that, whenever it becomes really a habit and you just do it, maybe you will not get as many benefits, because whenever it's a habit and it doesn't allow you to take a step back from your usual way of doing things, you may not get as much benefit from here. So, but that's a speculative answer, the second part, because I don't know of any work that has looked at schizophrenics in this regard. Fascinating question.
Okay, I see some people are starting to write more questions. If you want, you can also raise your hand. Here we have one from Mike.
Hey, Igor, thanks for the talk. I mean, I'm fairly familiar with the Illeist method paper, but I was wondering if you think that when you ask people to take a third person perspective and it's sort of productive in the ways that you've outlined, like, do you think, I mean, given your methodology, did they have any leeway to like fill in the blank of that he, she was someone they might admire and the way they behave in that situation? Or do you think people might spontaneously do that in general?
All right, I was unmuted finally. This is an interesting question. We don't really know. I think in most cases people were just using themselves, like it was supposed to be about them. But I think what you're after is this kind of what would Jesus do, which is kind of the North American thing, can sometimes be used sort of as a self-help strategy. I've been thinking about what would Jesus do as a study to do for a very long time. I still didn't get to it, but I think it could be in a way equivalent to this, where you would think of somebody whom you would admire, and that would allow you to. The mechanism there is arguably also the same type of distance, but maybe it's something else. So it's an empirical question. In this particular study, it's still about you, so you would not be using somebody else as an example, but the process may be very similar.
Okay, the next question comes from Will Gleason.
Hi, Igor. What a great study. Thanks so much. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I could go on. I could follow up what Mike just said, but I'm going to go in a different direction, somewhat different direction, which is to talk about the mechanism and ways to explore it, because this is pretty similar to what you were saying, Mike, but in a different direction. I'm curious, like, what other things could get the same effect? Like, what if you had people think about geological changes? You know, look at a fossil. You know, had people look at a fossil. Imagine what someone else would do. Imagine what their friend would do. Imagine it from the other person's perspective. I wonder if you could try out a bunch of different manipulations to sort of explore really what is the active ingredient in this distancing mechanism.
Yeah, it's a very good point. There may be many things going on. I mean, we do have evidence in this paper that people were writing in a more inclusive language. But as with any mediation analysis after an experimental manipulation, you don't really know if that's what's really the key ingredient of the effect, because that mediation is still cross-sectional. To explain more thoroughly, we looked at the language, and so people after the intervention who were in this kind of third-person writing group, when they wrote about the conflict, they were much more likely to use we and us instead of me and mine. And this is like, you know, irrespective, because these are the pre and post, so there is no instruction, there is no reason to. So there's a little bit of that. Now, whether this is the mechanism of the mechanism is a different story. I would love to do a large-scale field experiment with, 5 or 6 potential candidates, advice, friendship, moral exemplars, and of course, just do some kind of a horse race, similar to how my late friend Emile Bruno used to do it for prejudice research, where he would take 5 different possible manipulations of what would reduce prejudice in the real world, and then sees which of them are most effective. Yeah, if there are funders here and they would love, or if there are groups of people who want to put the resources together and do something like that, I would love that. But yeah, I mean, so we have some preliminary evidence for the mechanism, but as with every experimental approach to mechanism, whether it's really the mechanism is a different story.
We have one very brief clarification question, which is, was there also an increase in wisdom for people who wrote their diary in the first person?
The evidence is inconclusive in this regard. In the first study, no. In the second study, yes. And there are differences in modalities. In the second study, for instance, the pre and post measures were done in the same way, same modality, was all online. Whereas in the first study, you come into the lab and you write on the computer, and then you go back home and all the diary stuff is on the computer in your sort of natural habitat, so to say. So there's quite a bit more change. So that may explain it, but yeah, so it's inconclusive at this point. But certainly in the second study, and there are actually, from my other work of just doing diaries and Ethan's work too, we know that just keeping a diary over time makes you write, or like you subjectively start envisioning yourself more and more from a third person, up to a point. So in my 2016 piece on wisdom, we found that, and Ethan's former student, Jion Park, the Park and Cross would be authors, also found that in their diary work.
Okay, maybe one last question from the Google document. There's some work in psychology, internal family systems, NLP, and dialectical behavioral therapy suggesting a wise mind or inner mentor, with the idea being that we all have this inner wise person, some aspect of our character, and we should ask them for help. And that, the person thinks, should also be done in third person. Does your work suggest ways to use such tools or support this idea that those tools would be useful?
In a way, yes. I mean, certainly the dialectical behavioral therapy has many sort of overlaps with, at least conceptually, with the features of wisdom described here, as well as the mechanism that we try to tap at. Anything that would allow you to get to this kind of perspectival shift from your habitual way of thinking about the challenge that you're facing or difficult situation to this kind of big picture view. And I think distancing is one of them, and maybe talking to your inner self. But you would maybe automatically do in the third person is probably the case. It's an empirical question. So conceptually, yes, empirically, we need to do it and then find out.